Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday.
Happy birthday to fucking Hitler?
It was only in the year 2016 that Evalion briefly became world famous here on YouTube. Evalion was a political extremist, seemingly a ranting lunatic, whether sincerely or insincerely here on YouTube, and she had videos reaching 5 million, 10 million, 20 million people or more.
Don't you hate those lazy niggers who are never satisfied even after they are given reparation?
Nope, I really can't say I do. So as many of you guys know, a few days ago we found a very unique YouTuber. And that YouTuber went by the name of Evalion. She was racist and was literally being promoted by the fucking KKK. Not a joke.
Do you despise the Jews as much as I do?
And for millions of people, those videos by that fringe lunatic figure here on YouTube, that was the context in which for the first time they heard the political term alt-right. A lot of people today, even critics of the alt-right, forget just how extreme the meaning of the term already was back in 2016, when a lot of people in the mainstream press, even in the mainstream YouTube viewing audience, were encountering the word for the first time coming out of the mouth of Evalion. Another lunatic fringe political figure who came to prominence at that time was Brian Ruha. And I'm going to tell some anecdotes about him in this video because I want to talk to the guy. I also want to reflect a little bit on how the erasure of political extremism from YouTube has changed both political reality and the perception of these people and how we can cope with extremism and political problems. Just Googling around now, I see, unsurprisingly, that most of Brian Ruha's videos here on YouTube have been deleted. Evalion's videos, long time ago, all of them are deleted. And she repeatedly tried to start new YouTube channels, and those were also shut down. Completely understandable. But the result is, in her case, the only videos that remain up are actually some comedians making fun of her. And in a sense, that's important. It's important that we have the echo of what happened historically. At least we have the critique of her, the comedians ridiculing her. Those two, under the current guidelines from YouTube, they're at least demonetized. They might well be deleted in the fullness of time. Here on YouTube, if you criticize someone for being racist, that is treated as tantamount to being racist yourself. I've had to deal with this. And I guess I should pause here and put in a disclaimer. Ethnically, I'm Jewish. I'm not a member of the Jewish faith. I mean, politically, right now, if I had to choose between voting for Bernie Sanders and voting for Donald Trump, I would vote for Bernie Sanders. Within a European political context, I think I'd be a pragmatist near the center. But, politically, I have absolutely no sympathy with the alt-right or far-right people. I especially have no sympathy with these figures. Anyway, it's strange that I think people, including critics of the alt-right, they now tend to remember the alt-right as if it had been more moderate all along, whereas in fact it was much more extreme. But most of the evidence of that extremism, even from as recently as 2016, has been deleted. It's just literally been erased from the internet. And the members of the alt-right themselves had to adapt by using code words and indirect forms of expression. So this doesn't just change the perception of the problem, it changes the problem itself. So what I saw today in Googling around for Brian Ruha is that there's almost no trace of just what an extremist he was. He does have a current YouTube channel where any trace of his history as a neo-Nazi and as a Hitler supporter is gone. And I see a few websites and a few other YouTube channels trying to warn people, look, this guy Brian Ruha is going around and giving lectures, he's doing this and that as a political activist, he's still trying to be a spokesperson for Buddhism, he's still presenting himself as an expert on Buddhism as a religion, but you need to be aware there's this other side, there's this darker side to his character, there's this darker side to what he represents and advocates for. But looking around YouTube today, or even Google searching the whole internet today, you're not going to find it. So look, obviously, what these people represent politically is terrible. But by taking away their ability to state their terrible views honestly and openly, what have we done? We've created this really, really strange, difficult, inextricable puzzle where people can't really criticize Brian Rua for what he is. They can't criticize Evalion for what she is. They can't show clips of these people saying what they really say. You'll be censored yourself if you do this. And in a weird way, in Brian Rua's case, the result is that he gets to carry on with impunity. He now gets to present himself to the world as some kind of respectable scholar of Buddhism, which he is not, or as a lay preacher, lay disciple of the Theravada Buddhist faith. And in the case of Evalion, we're lucky in a sense that we have a record about what an extremist she was, preserved by some comedians. I'll give a link below this video. Some people making fun of her, and they have clips of what she actually said in the course of criticizing her, making fun of her. But now if that disappears, then what are we left with? And then, as I say, the next stage in the evolution was just that it trained the alt-right to present themselves with these complex code words.
Just as retake Constantinople is a fun way of saying, we might be in a chaotic situation in a few years in Europe.
Hey everyone, it's Corey McCarthy. This is a video I never expected to make, and it is certainly not fitting for this channel, but that said, it had to be made this once. As some of you may be aware by now, someone who I will not name, but who is involved in a good deal of vegan internal drama on YouTube, has released a video about me, accusing me of being a racist. I didn't watch the whole thing, but I can speak clearly about where I come from, my thoughts, for clarification on this matter. If you want to find out more about this topic, the Golden One shares many of my views, so I suggest you check out his channel as he discusses these topics in far greater detail.
I try to spread the good word, the sacred word of enlightenment on Facebook, and I have 22,000 followers there. But at the end of the day, this is not a victory for the people who reported a 2-year-old picture. I am not jesting. It's a 2-year-old picture with a pro-European message. I don't have the picture here right now, but it was nothing hateful or anything. It was just a pro-nationalist European message. Now YouTube has partnered up with ADL to silence right-wing channels. If you watch my videos and I'm not ultra clear with everything, it's just that I can't say everything outright because, yeah, yet again, when I reminisce about all these years and the tremendously hard work I've put into everything, I don't want to jeopardize it by, the need for being ultra clear in all regards. Just as retake Constantinople is a fun way of saying, we might be in a chaotic situation in a few years in Europe.
That said, I have no problem with limited immigration, so long as those immigrating genuinely love the country, its people, its culture, and its values. They have to have a strong desire and intent to assimilate to the best of their ability. I don't for one second believe that anyone should be treated as less due to their ethnicity, nor do I harbor even an ounce of hatred for anyone. I simply believe that everyone has a right to cherish and preserve their own homelands, ethnicities, and cultures.
Yes, I am proud of my European ancestry, and I do not feel any white guilt for goings-ons in the past by people of the past. I think the whole concept of white guilt is absolutely absurd. And as you can imagine, I take issue with many of the thoughts promoted by globalists and the mainstream media. I also do not believe that multiculturalism works, nor that importing hordes of people with vastly different cultures to our own is beneficial to either them or us in the long run. Just look at the turmoil and violence ever increasing in Europe, and the racial tensions we already have in the United States as it is.
The next stage in the evolution was just that it trained the alt-right to present themselves with these complex code words, indirect forms of expression, so on and so forth, that only makes it more difficult for all of us to address, what their beliefs really are, what their assumptions really are, even to present facts, even to carry on a discussion or a debate where we really get to, the basis of what their concerns are or what their goals are, what they're trying to accomplish. I mean, ultimately, in a democracy, no political claim can be treated as unthinkable. It takes tremendous, terrible patience to really address the public's concerns. I'll give you a great example. I mean, the collapse of the World Trade Center after September 11th, a lot of people's concerns about that are stupid and ignorant. And it takes tremendous patience to set out an argument where you look at the facts of the architecture and explain what happened and why, explain how this is possible, even getting into the technical details of how the airplanes were hijacked. But don't you think that's an important role in a democracy? Don't you think it's important to explain to people how these things were possible, how they happened? People are stupid and ignorant, and it's got to be the role of someone to educate and engage the public, and so our society can roll ahead and become more sophisticated and more cosmopolitan and not retreat into more and more self-righteous ignorance. I guess that's really the fundamental concern I have here. It's not ignorance. It's the overlap of self-righteousness and ignorance. It's really dangerous. And as all these people show, it's appealing. It's appealing to an audience. So look, how did I end up having a conversation with Brian Rua? This is years and years ago. I would guess about 6 years ago, 5.5 years ago. I talked to this guy via Skype. And I'm sure I still have the emails that led up to the conversation if I wanted to figure out the exact date when I talked to this guy. When I talked to Brian Rua, at that time, he did not have a single video on YouTube that had anything to do with right-wing ideology, that had anything to do with Hitler. He did not have a single video on YouTube to do with the Nazis. There was no overt indication at all of his fascination with that kind of political extremism. None. There was nothing overtly anti-Semitic. However, because I was a scholar of Buddhism, when I watched his videos just about Buddhist philosophy, I could tell that he was using Nazi sources. I could tell. I knew the source material well enough. So, I mean, it's really hard to come up with a parallel in Christianity, but like if someone really knew different trains of thought in the interpretation of the Gospels, and they could identify, your interpretation is from this school of thought, you could tell. I could tell just from what he said about Buddhism at that time that he was on the slippery slope into becoming an outright fascist or Nazi, that he was reading that kind of material. Now, I was in a very strange situation when I decided to reach out to him and talk to him by Skype. Brian, at that time, he openly said on his channel, I think he was a little bit vague, I'm not criticizing him for this, but he vaguely stated that he had recently been divorced and moved to a new home. And it was obviously a period of transition. He was obviously, kind of vulnerable. I think it's not unfair to say that he was in danger of losing his mind. He looked like he was kind of on the edge of a collapse or breakdown. And on the other hand, I could see that he was in part really sincere in preaching Theravada Buddhism. So I really was an expert in Theravada Buddhism as much as any sane person was at that time. And I say that advisedly. I met and spoke to many of the greatest scholars of Theravada Buddhism that were alive during my generation. And of course, there were greater scholars than myself. What was rare was to meet someone who had done the scholarship and remained sane and detached and down to earth and honest, and who would actually answer questions you had. So to give an example, if you want to talk about the history of slavery in Buddhism, good luck. You talk to one of those guys, somebody who's really ideologically committed to Theravada Buddhism, or someone who's just gone crazy after being a scholar this way for years, you are not going to get a straight or honest answer about the history of slavery in the Buddhist religion. Where I was someone who, even if I was a less accomplished scholar, I'd done the reading, I'd done the research, and I'd tell you the truth about something like that, even if the truth was embarrassing to the history of the religion. I'll mention also, I once had a conversation with a genuinely devout Buddhist monk, who, even though I dislike the guy personally, I really do, I can say as a sincere compliment to him that he really was a sincere monk and a sincere scholar of Buddhism. He tried in his way to live that life. He tried to walk the ancient narrow path. And he said to me one day, we were in his library in a monastery in Sri Lanka, And he said to me one day, sitting in the humble chair next to the bookshelf in this small room full of books, he said to me, you know, Eisel, many of the scholars, I think he said most of the scholars who study Buddhist philosophy, they go crazy. And I'll always remember he used the phrase, they lose their marbles. And he sat there laughing, just thinking about it. He was like, he was recalling the different scholars of Buddhism he knew, over decades, I guess, and that they'd gone crazy. And, of course, there's a lot of evidence for that. I know from meeting some of those people face to face, but also if you read their writing carefully, even when it's been edited, sure, a lot of the scholars of Buddhism went crazy. It was an interesting, wistful moment. He was sitting there reflecting on this. But this is how I replied, without missing a beat. I leaned in and I said to him, you presume that they were not crazy before they chose to become scholars of Buddhist philosophy. So we had a chat about that, because that's a different kind of skepticism I have, is how sane or how crazy were these people before they got started. And yeah, in this context, we could ask this about Brian Ruha also. It's not so easy to say that he got involved with Buddhism and went crazy, and it's not so easy to say that he got involved with Nazism and went crazy. Anyway, I decided, this is again something like 6 years ago, I decided to reach out to the guy and offer to speak to him by Skype, partly just because of that most simple, sympathetic thing. I thought, if our positions were reversed, I would really value it if someone like that reached out to me. Because here I was, my position was, I'd already been a scholar of Pali, of Theravada Buddhism, and had this experience, and I could recognize in him the little bit of sincere work and good intention he'd done. But I could also recognize that he was either going crazy or really was crazy. He'd gotten divorced from his wife and so on. It seemed like he was in a difficult transitional period in his life. He could probably use the help, or at least use the conversation. So I got in touch with him by email, set up a Skype conversation, and we had this one long Skype call. And the issue of the extent to which he was flirting with or reading Nazi sources, I waited until about the middle of the conversation. So I didn't just confront him with that. I didn't just abruptly say to him, look, are you secretly some kind of Nazi? But I did bring it up. One of the interesting things about that conversation, he was formerly married to a woman who was not white, not European. He was married to this woman, which again, given that the guy is literally a neo-Nazi. He's literally a pro-Hitler neo-Nazi he literally grows the mustache and everything in some of his videos, some of his photos. This is a little bit surprising. But, he told me that, he fell in love with this woman and married her. They were together, I guess, for years. I forget. And that she was a spirit medium. She would channel spirits and she would do these performances, these rituals involving ghosts. And she earned her money that way. People paid a significant amount of money for her to do these, I don't know if you call them seances or ghost channeling ceremonies. And it was obvious to me that part of the reason he fell in love with her and part of the relationship was that he really respected this about her. Or, he also had some kind of spiritual curiosity, at least at the time when they first got together as husband and wife. And, we talked about the turning point in his life where he really had to admit to himself that this was a kind of scam. There was something, this was something ultimately fraudulent, that people were paying money for something that was misleading or insincere or unreal. And I thought that was interesting because we were having this conversation in the context of him still being committed to quite a lot of supernatural and impossible stuff within Buddhism. He was still defending those beliefs. And then also he was reaching out for and bringing in even crazier, more ridiculous stuff and adding it to Buddhism, if you like. So he at that time had both YouTube videos and I think website pages discussing his beliefs in UFOs, meaning space aliens and UFOs, discussing his belief in Sasquatch, leprechauns, like anything like this. And he would try to construe that like the belief in leprechauns was validated by ancient Buddhist texts and stuff like that. And, in the friendliest way possible, I confronted him on that and said, look, why would you do this with the text? This discredits you as a scholar of Buddhism, and when the people who wrote this ancient text wrote it, they couldn't possibly have been thinking of the modern American idea of a Sasquatch. So, like, what are you doing here? And I was politely enough challenging him on his whole kind of supernatural approach to those texts. Now, as I say again, I'm ethnically Jewish. It's somewhat bizarre for me to reflect that after that conversation I had with him, and I must be one of very, very few people to have challenged him on, his view of Buddhism. I mean, I know he spends time with Buddhist monks. He still gives lectures on Buddhist philosophy to this day. That shortly after that, he got into this downward spiral of alt-right extremism. He did an interview with Evalion, the infamous neo-Nazi who's been mentioned here. That's one of the things he was most famous for. I mean, Evalion had millions and millions of views. And then as soon as his name was attached to her, and they did a series of videos together, not just one. So he had several videos with her appearing on his channel, and he interviewed her and so on. He became notorious on the internet for these, Nazi extremist views that he started spouting. I do have to wonder, looking back, if my challenging him on the supernatural hocus-pocus aspects of Buddhism at that time, when he was reflecting on his divorce and his marriage and his disillusionment with spirituality and ghosts to some extent, I wonder if that resulted in him trying to reach out for something real, reach out for something more meaningful in his life. I've been talking a lot lately to Faraday Speaks. Faraday Speaks is the name of the YouTube channel. The guy's real name is Caleb Kane. And, Faraday has been doing this work trying to rehabilitate or challenge alt-right people who believe in these right-wing and sometimes racist, sometimes anti-Semitic ideals. And, at the same time, I think he recognizes, I think this because I've talked about him, and I've talked about it with him, and I've heard his opinion. He recognizes that a lot of people are reaching out for something meaningful. They're reaching out for something real. They're reaching out for a way to make the world a better place. And it's tragic that this is what they grab onto. They grab onto this horrible conspiracy theory nonsense. But nevertheless, you have to recognize the intentions there on a really, really basic level. And then the next element of it that's tragic, I talked about this with Faraday just a couple days ago, is that a lot of these people, the reason why their parents don't intervene and don't say, hey, wait, stop, you're going crazy. The reason why maybe their girlfriends or boyfriends don't intervene and say, hey, wait, stop, you're going crazy, is that for many of them, the way they respond to making contact with this extremist ideology is they get more motivated with their health, with fitness. They get motivated to start reading history. I mean, stereotypically, all of a sudden they're interested in the history of the Roman Empire. All of a sudden they're interested in, more important nonfiction literature about the history of Europe, the history of quote unquote the West. They get interested in these kinds of things. It's very easy for the people surrounding these ideologues, the people surrounding these true believers, to observe their first steps into an extremist cult as positive rather than negative. And of course, I think that's an interesting contrast to how people might perceive someone stepping into Buddhism or what have you. But there's no doubt that for a lot of those people, they find in that ideology, just like the ideology of Jordan Peterson, they find in it some kind of motivation, some kind of touchstone to quit playing video games. For many of them, quit watching pornography. That's always an issue they want to talk about. To get on a more puritanical, self-disciplined lifestyle. But also, as I say, for them, they start exercising that part of their character that's ultimately caring and concerned about making the world a better place. What I hope is that for a lot of these people, it's a phase that they'll grow out of. When I look at the ideologies that have come and gone during my lifetime, I remember being on the streets when the Occupy Wall Street protests were happening. I was married at that time, now split up with the woman I was married to. But I remember both of us were there, and we both said, look, this Occupy Wall Street movement, It's going to come and go in just a couple of years, maybe a couple months, maybe a couple of years, whatever we said then. But this is not going to last. And meanwhile, there's this other set of protests that we were really interested in going to. There are these protests for First Nations people, the Indigenous people of Canada, Native Americans, Cree, Ojibwe, Mi'kmaq. There were these other protests going on at the same time. We're like, this struggle, this political problem, this has already gone on for at least 100 years, and this is still going to be going on 10 years from now. It's probably going to be going on 50 years from now, 100. This is really important. This is really deep. We could see the difference between something evanescent and shallow, something really deep and durable there. In the same way, I really don't think any of the elements of alt-right, current fashionable right-wing extremism, I don't think any of them are durable. I hope that the desire to make the world a better place, the desire to help, and the curiosity that led people into that alt-right trap, I hope that that will be durable. I hope that that'll survive it. And I noticed that Brian Ruha, as crazy and evil as he may be, he seems to have given up on that extremist ideology and gone back to trying to be some kind of Buddhist preacher. I know that Evalion, as crazy as she was, she made statements on the internet. They were in written text form explaining that she was no longer racist. She no longer believed in killing or hating anybody. She made a whole series of statements about how she went through a personal progression and she realized that a lot of the things she believed about the history of World War II and the history of Europe were wrong. She's probably both of them are still crazy. Probably both of them are still crazy, but they may at least be less dangerous. And unfortunately, with the way internet censorship has changed, the public can't see that transformation anymore. The erasure of the steps along the way, it makes it difficult to hold those people to account. Like if someone today in Vancouver is wanting to check, who is this guy giving a lecture on Buddhism? Who is he really? What is his political background? What does he represent? When you Google that now, you're not going to find any of that evidence. The evidence is gone. It makes it harder to hold them to account. And I think it makes it impossible for most regular people to learn from their mistakes.